Hello everyone, and today we are looking at Virgie's TED Talk. This video is titled Lose Hate, Not Weight, so let's just jump right into it.
Hi, I'm Virgie Tovar, and I'm here tonight to talk to you about how body size affects people's lives, relationships, and careers. Specifically, how being fat affects these things. People of all sizes tend to report a dissatisfaction with their bodies, but fat people tend to have less access to meaningful participation in society. Most people believe that discriminating against fat people isn't discrimination at all. Sometimes we don't even realize how our implicit bias affects the ways we view the world around us. For example, is it possible that you would believe me or imagine me a qualified expert if I were 250 pounds instead of the size I am now? Let's see. Hi, I'm Virgie Tovar. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about the ways that bodies...
So that was kind of a weird opening. I don't really know, I think the point was that implicit bias would make you less likely to consider the real Virgie, who's heavier, as an authority on body image or whatever, however exactly she qualified that, versus the thinner woman that was talking. But the thinner woman wasn't skinny. Don't get me wrong, she looked fine. This is not a judgment on her looks, but she's not what I would call a skinny woman. She still looked a bit overweight, just not Virgie level big or anything. And Virgie isn't even that big by fat acceptance standards. She's definitely obese, but she would be, I think, still considered a small fat by their standards, wouldn't she? That felt like very true Virgie of this weird head game she tries to play sometimes.
Size affects people's lives, relationships, and careers, in particular, how being fat affects these things. People of all sizes tend to report dissatisfaction with their bodies, but fat people actually have less access to meaningful participation in society. Most people believe that discrimination against fat people isn't discrimination at all. Sometimes it's difficult to see how implicit bias shapes.
Here's the thing, I'm not gonna say it's not discrimination, because I do think that there is discrimination against fat people. My issue comes in when you're trying to equate it with systematic oppression, as seen with racial minorities, the LGBT community, and religions that receive persecution in the US and in some other countries. It's not saying that there isn't discrimination. The issue is that you're taking discrimination and prejudice, which are broader terms and lack the sense of oppression that some of the bigger words like oppression have, and it's acknowledging it, but it's acknowledging it on a smaller basis, to the point where it's not a systemic issue, and where it's it could impact individual people, but it's not quite the same as barriers specifically for a specific group, the way we see it with the LGBT community and racial minorities. That's where a lot of people, I think, come in and have issues with the fat acceptance, fat liberation movements, is that they are taking these small sections that I'm sure many experience and blow it up into something bigger, like bigotry. And they try to coin terms like fat phobia and that sort of thing, and sizeism. They are over pathologizing and over intellectualizing the prejudice that I'm sure that they face, but I don't think that it is to the level of, and I think most people don't think it's to the level of what racial minorities and the LGBT community face. That's where the true issue comes in. It's not that people think that, people aren't prejudiced against fat people. It's that the prejudice doesn't reach reach a level of bigotry, systemic bigotry, and that's where the breakdown and the disagreements tend to come in. It's not that most people are unwilling to acknowledge any struggles that fat people face, because I think if you ask any one person, do you think a fat person is likely to experience some level of humiliation in a public space in their lifetime? I think most people would acknowledge that would likely happen, because most of us can acknowledge that people are fucking assholes sometimes. The issue is when you take that and you try to say, do they experience oppression and bigotry? Those are big words that we associate with bigger social movements and more credible social movements than this one. And that's where the issue comes in.
The way we see the world around us. For example, is it possible that you are less likely to believe me or imagine me as a trained professional or an expert now that you know that I'm the real Virgie Tovar? While you think about that, I want to tell you a story. I want you to imagine me at 4 years old. My favorite part of the day was when we got home from running errands or from preschool. I would push open the front door with both small hands and I would take off running through the living room, through the hallway.
This doesn't even, because we've read her book now, I'm going to let her finish her story, but this doesn't even read genuine now, because it is already word for word what she wrote down in the introduction. And to me, if you are reciting something word for word what you had written down, is it a memory or was it at least somewhat constructed? This is what I mean with Virgie stuff, is where I think broad strokes happened. I think she used to to get naked after preschool like a lot of toddlers do. Narration, which has already within the first few sentences been so exact with what she wrote down in her book, it makes it seem artificial. Am I wrong?
Past my bedroom, past the washer dryer that made funny sounds that I liked, and into the bathroom. I would take off all my clothes, wiggling out of my pants, nearly ripping my way out of my t-shirt like it was an inconvenient membrane. I would leave my clothes in a pile on the floor and I would take off back towards the kitchen where my grandmother was always cooking. When I reached the end of the hallway where the calico cat-colored rug turned into the linoleum of the hallway, rather of the dining room, I would stop. I would spread out my arms and legs as far as I could, and I would jiggle. My thighs and belly, my cheeks would wobble, my entire body would undulate like the water in the bathtub or like at the community pool that I love so much in the summer. My body was like that water, a source of relief and fun, a place I could jump into and feel held. It felt good. Oh, it felt so good. I think back on that story now and I can barely believe that it's my own.
I don't know, there's something about the way she tells her story sometimes that just come across as a little creepy to me. But more specifically, back on that point of this seems so this was basically word for word what was in the introduction. I don't even have to reread the introduction because she has recited what is essentially, I can tell it's exactly what she wrote in the introduction. Down to minute details that when if I'm writing down a story and then I'm retelling it, a lot of the details that I wrote down tend to get lost because that's just part of human memory, is that you're not going to be able to tell everything exactly the same way when it's coming from a true memory, as to where if you're reciting a monologue, you're more likely to get those details down. Which I find interesting because this comes off more like a recited monologue than a recounted memory. And perhaps part of that is just that she had been preparing for this TED Talk, and so it's part of her speech. That's quite possibly something, but given that it's the exact same language as was in her book, it reads as artificial to me.
It feels so far away. I feel protective of that little girl who could not have imagined the horrible education and body shame that was awaiting her. Less than a year later, those jiggle-filled afternoons would disappear. I would enter kindergarten, and the kids in my class would teach me the lessons that they had learned about bodies from the culture. My native relationship to my body would be stolen from me, and in its place would grow one toxic idea. Your body is wrong. That idea would threaten my happiness and ultimately my health for the next nearly 2 decades. It turns out that my story, even the timing of the events, were part of a bigger cultural narrative. Researchers have found that very young U.S. children show an understanding that fatness should be avoided at pretty much any cost. In fact, they asked a group of 5-year-olds if they would rather lose an arm or be fat, and they chose losing an arm. I was not unlike those 5-year-olds.
One, I would like to know where she got this piece of evidence. She didn't say specifically where. I'd be very curious. And two, here's the issue with 5 years old. They think that their arm might grow back. Like, that's been an actual thing. Like, I've had to explain to kids, you're not a lizard. I know that there's some lizards that can, like, regrow appendages, but you are not one. I don't know. If this is, like, something that she actually read, there's an issue with a 5-year-old's understanding of reality that colors that narrative a little bit. I don't know.
I too believe that I should do anything in my power to change my body because I'd been taught that people like me were ugly and inferior, that my fatness was an external manifestation of internal monstrosity. Even though I hated dieting, I did it for nearly 20 years because I believed I had to lose weight if I wanted love, success, visibility, and freedom. I believed that life would begin later. I would wear a bathing suit later. I would go on a date later. I would wear my favorite outfit. I would travel later. The history of dieting is much older than most people realize. The grandfather of modern-day dieting was named Reverend Sylvester Graham. He rose to prominence in the 1800s and is now known for his namesake invention, the graham cracker. Graham believed that delicious, well-spiced foods led to lasciviousness, and that low-flavor, low-fat foods led to purity of mind and body. He started the dietary reform movement. He and his followers believed that through food, you could control morality. The same ideological basis of dieting today. Dieting was there during every formative step of my life. I was starving myself for the first time in the summer before elementary school. I was on a diet the day I graduated from high school. I had my first bout of hunger-induced exhaustion when I was overseas in college for the first time. And when I got my BA in political science, I was calorie counting the meal following the ceremony. It never once occurred to me that maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe there was something not quite right about a culture that hated me so much just because I was bigger than other people. I never thought to blame fat phobia, the bigotry ideology that positions fat people as inferior. I only ever blamed myself. It wasn't until I began researching fat in graduate school that my ideas about all of this began to change. It was 2010 and
Researching fat in graduate school. How exactly? I would like to know what is her degree in. Like, maybe we can find that out. So I found her LinkedIn page, and it says she has a bachelor's degree in political science and then a master's in human sexuality. So I'm guessing, since she said graduate school, I'm guessing that, and she said 2010 right before I paused it, so which fits in right here. She was studying fat under the guise or the discipline of human sexuality.
and fat studies was an emerging discipline with only a handful of books and articles. It was in this fledgling environment that I began
She said fat studies was an emerging discipline in 2010. Well, it's 2022 and it's still not a discipline. So I'm guessing this was more of because it was graduate school, there's a little bit more flexibility with what you can focus on. My guess is she wanted this to become a discipline, and it is a possibility that looking at weight in terms of a social contract could have appeared in some larger disciplines. I guess human sexuality would be one. Given that there's a big focus on intersectionality in gender and women's studies, that's also a place where it could surface, not as its own, but as something else to take into consideration. But as its own discipline, I think no.
Interviewing women who had been fat their whole lives. I wanted to understand how their body size had affected the trajectory of their lives. I found that no matter what I asked them in interviews, the stories kept coming back to clothing, gender, alienation. One of my participants told me about what it was like growing up for her and how she always felt like she was straddling a line between boy and girl. A lot of times during playtime, little girls reenact heterosexual romances, and a lot of times the biggest girl is just chosen as the most appropriate for the boyfriend or the husband role. This is rarely discussed. It's often just understood that the biggest girl is best suited for the role. A number of my participants talked about never being able to find clothing in the girls' department, their department, and still others talked about how little boys in their school when they grew up treated them more roughly than they did their smaller girlfriends. I found that these experiences led to gender confusion. And often in adulthood, many of my participants had much more sophisticated gender stories, and they felt that they had to perform gender more aggressively and more creatively than their smaller counterparts. I began to realize that the way that I had been taught to think of fat, the way that I'd been taught to see my own body was not inevitable. It wasn't even universal. It was cultural. In no other example did this become more clear than when I began reading the work of anthropologists who did ethnographies in regions of the contemporary world where women go to extreme lengths to become as fat as possible, because where they live, fat rolls and stretch marks are the height of feminine beauty. Sometimes women even die from consuming weight-gaining medications designed for animals. I realize that no matter what the standard, fat or thin, women will go to extraordinary lengths to fulfill whatever their culture standard of beauty happens to be if they don't feel like they have a viable alternative.
Okay, so she's acknowledging that there are women that will go, and even the article that she's saying says forced to be fat, as though fat is not a particularly desirable thing here, and it seems more like the acknowledgement of unattainable beauty standards across cultures here. So I don't know, it seems a bit counterproductive to like the title of this TED talk and like her overall. I mean I'm glad she's acknowledging it, don't get me wrong, but there's that whole thing with also fat girls feel like they need to perform their gender more aggressively than their thin counterparts, and I don't know about that. I mean, that's a possibility. There's also just sometimes so not all the time. I want to be clear, this isn't all the time, but this is the case for me, is that I was heavier, but I was also a bit of a tomboy. And I know for plenty of tomboy girls, both thin and fat, that there is a little bit of, I don't know if I would go so far as to call, well, possibly gender confusion. I think that's actually probably a fair one of, am I a girl because I don't really want to express femininity in this way, or is this just how I am a girl? Like that could definitely be a whole thing. But I don't know, there's something about the way she phrased it. Perhaps it's just that it's Virgie, and I'm always take whatever Virgie says with a grain of salt, so perhaps that's what it is.
In the midst of all this, I was going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole as a scholar and as a person, and someone asked me if I'd ever heard of a conference specifically designed for fat people. Well, I hadn't, but I looked it up online, registered, and a few weeks later, I was on the BART, taking a bus to Oakland, California, where the conference was being held. I dragged my sad little navy blue suitcase, a broke grad student, through the parking lot of the hotel, and I entered the breezeway. And about halfway through, I could smell chlorine. I could hear splashing. And as I exited the breezeway, I saw something that I'd never seen before. Something I had been told did not exist. All around the pool were gorgeous fat women in amazing bathing suits. They were laughing and chatting. They were swimming and napping. They were just living without any discernible trace of the shame I'd always seen on women like them, women like us. And then something even more magical happened. From the edge of this tableau came a redhead. Big arms, big belly, big thighs. She was wearing a red vintage cut bathing suit covered in white polka dots and dramatic cat eye sunglasses. She did not walk, she sauntered. And trailing behind her was a boy carrying a parasol over her head so she wouldn't burn.
Little questionable about the boy carrying a parasol, but here's the thing. Were you actually told that never happens, that doesn't exist? Were you, actually explicitly told that? Or was that something that you assumed and then you blamed your culture for making you feel that way? Because this is a thing that I've noticed with some fat logic people, and I apologize for my dog barking. There's a neighbor over. I've actually already been interrupted, 3 times so far. And so I apologize if this video isn't as good as I typically try to get out with commentary. But back to the point. The issue that I have with the fat logic groups is that they will say that society says X, Y, and Z, or that everyone tells them X, Y, and Z about their bodies and about how they should behave and about how they should feel and about, what they are and stuff. And it's like there's implication and then there's inference. And sometimes you can infer something that was not implied. You know what I mean? So this is a case of, I'm assuming that you inferred that despite the fact that no one implied it. I don't, in general, throughout society, barring massive, my 600-pound life types of overweight, maybe a little less, maybe around 400 pounds, that is potentially something that I think could possibly be expressed, but Virgie's only 250 pounds, and I say only, I understand that that's a lot, but from the general fat logic, fat acceptance, fat liberation people, she's not that big. And so I find it hard to believe that, because people that were overweight but under 300 pounds have been around forever, and I never got the slovenly stereotype with them. It's usually been people that are bigger than that you get those kind of stereotypes. So for Virgie to say that at 250 pounds she had she had been told, whether by our culture or whatever, that it would be impossible for women to just enjoy being in bathing suits in the sun and stuff. I'm gonna call some bullshit on that and say that was more of an inference on her part and an artificial barrier she put on herself. We put artificial barriers on ourselves all the time. Oh, I could never do that. Oh, I could never learn that. Oh, I could never be this good. Oh, I could never XYZ. Everyone, I think, at least at some point in their lives, puts an artificial barrier on themselves based on their perception of what they can achieve and what they cannot achieve. And for her artificial barrier was that she could never live the life she wanted to at the weight that she is. But the issue with it is that that's a barrier that she placed on herself, not that society placed on her, but then she still blames society for it.
Some might call this a come to Jesus moment. When I saw her, I saw the potential for my own shame-free future. In 2014, not long after that poolside moment, I started a campaign called Lose Hate, Not Weight. I wanted to tell people that it was not weight that needed to be shed, but rather the ideology that we aren't perfect no matter what our size. I began to solicit submissions from women. I wanted to understand women who had declared peace in their relationship on their body, women who had stopped trying to control their weight. One of the first stories I got was from a woman named Abby. Abby started to have excruciating uterine cramps in her 20s, and she tried to ignore it, but ended up at the hospital, and her doctor took one look at her, saw a fat person, and rather than examine her, told her that she simply needed to lose weight, and the pain would go away. Even though Abby sensed there was something more serious happening inside, she didn't feel empowered to speak back to the doctor. So she left, and she didn't return to another doctor for 3 years. And during those 3 years, a tumor grew inside of her, unmonitored and undetected. She spent most of her 20s in treatment for cancer, and she told me that the language that she heard about cancer, that it was an invasive alien force that had taken over her body, reminded her of the way that people had talked about her fatness. And through making peace with cancer, she was able to make peace with her body. Abby is now...
I am suspect a little bit of this conversation. I can definitely see how, by working through cancer and stuff, you become more at peace with your body, because there's this appreciation just for life at that point, because cancer is a very scary thing. The comparison of an alien force of taking over your body and equating that with how people had spoke about her fatness, I'm wondering how much of that was editorialized by Virgie. Because Virgie, we've seen it in the book, and we've seen it even a bit in this TED Talk. Again, broad strokes seem to be true, but then there's a lot of editorializing that she does that makes her stories kind of sus. And so I can't help but take everything that she says, cut it in half, split the difference, and say that maybe half of it is true. So I think that perhaps the woman that had battled cancer, because she's not here to tell us her own story, we just have to take Virgie's word for it. I tend to be more like, I tend to be a little bit more critical of it. If the woman was here actually telling us her story, then I'd be more inclined to believe it. But because it's Virgie recounting a conversation, and we've seen how she gives details that don't seem to fit facts, like she did with her story of preschool and the boy that was looking up girls' skirts, and what his intent was behind that. I think that perhaps she did make peace with her body, make peace with being fat, this woman that she's talking about, because she had to go through such a big ordeal. But whether she compared the illness of cancer to how people talked about her fatness, I'm highly suspect of.
In remission. One of my favorite stories came from a woman named Erin. Erin was in a terrible car accident when she was in college. A truck came over the dividing line, hit her head on, and totaled her car. She had to be removed with the jaws of life and helicoptered to the nearest hospital. Even though nearly every inch of her body was covered in lacerations and bruises, her internal organs were perfectly intact. Her doctor told her that if she hadn't been carrying a little extra weight, she would have definitely died. She said to me, "It's pretty hard to hate your body after something like that." Erin is now a well-known burlesque star in Seattle. I want to leave you with one last story.
So this feels like it's promoting that thing of, obese people are more likely to survive a gunshot. And while I'm glad that worked out for that woman, I don't think that that's like just in case you're in a situation where you might need that extra layer of fat, doesn't really correlate with the general risks that you have by carrying a lot of extra weight. here's the thing, the general message of love your body regardless of what size it is, I actually don't have a problem with. It's how they try to legitimize this perspective. I think the perspective is legitimate regardless. I think you should be able to be comfortable in the skin that you're in, and whether you want to work towards something different or not is up to you. But I think the way that they try to legitimize this perspective is what causes more issues for their movement.
And it's one that occurred recently in November. I took a group of women to Jamaica, and every single morning we would walk out to the edge of the Caribbean Sea. We would spread out our arms and legs as far as we could, and we would jiggle.
I swear to God, she has like a fetish for jiggling or something. It's weird. What is it with her and jiggling? Like, it's one thing if you're like, we stood out there, we stretched our arms and legs as wide as we could and just embraced the moment. Like, that's fine. But there's something, I mean, she always goes back to jiggling. What is that about?
The experience released something inside of us, the remembrance of freedom, the remembrance and the connection to ourselves as magical, the idea that our bodies are these incredible vehicles that take us through the most meaningful parts of our lives. So I want to leave you with the sentiment that you shouldn't wait one more day, one more pound. The next time that you look in the mirror and you have the impulse to judge the body you see, or you look at another person and have the impulse to judge their body, remember that childlike sense of wonder. After all, you have nothing to lose but your shame. Thank you.
So, notice the guy at the end running with what looked like a parasol in reference to her story. Whatever. Anyway, like, my closing thoughts on this are, one, this seemed kind of like a carbon copy of, like, full-on sections of her book. Like, you could probably take out a third of this, and you'll take out a section, like, because that was all stuff that we heard in her book. The general message, here's the thing, I don't necessarily have a problem with the general message, but I don't like the way it's presented. I don't like the presentation that, hey, this woman survived potential serious injury because of her fatness. Even if that's true and stuff, I think presenting it like this is a reason to be fat is a bad idea. That being said, it seemed like she was trying to couch this more in a self-love aspect, so it's kind of hard for me to say. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. Again, sorry if the commentary wasn't great. It was surprisingly active while I was trying to record this, and because I'd already been through about half of this when I started getting interrupted, I didn't want to start over and miss what certain comments that I had when I was first making this. So I hope this was okay. Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.